And now it has been my pleasure to introduce John Diaconus. John and I have now worked on multiple programs for the library, and it has been a wonderful alliance. John is from the Miller House in Katona, and he has these great ideas of programs, and he always generously includes the Chappaqua Library. So John, I want to thank you, and I want to introduce you because you will be introducing David. So thank you again, John, and welcome everybody.
Thank you, Joan, and it's been an honor to work with the Chappaqua Library and you in particular, and I think this is our 5th program together. I'm with the Friends of the Miller House, Washington's headquarters. We are a charitable organization that seeks to educate and raise awareness with respect to the Miller House, Washington's headquarters, which is located in the town of North Castle, which during the Battle of White Plains in 1776 was part of Newcastle. Newcastle was within the town of North Castle at that point. We are tonight going to speak about a forgotten founding father named John Jay. And one of my questions to David will be, why was John Jay, why is he a forgotten founder? Because he has quite a reputation. He was and had a number of accomplishments. He was a governor of New York, president of the Second Continental Congress. He negotiated the treaty with, I think it was Ben Franklin and John Adams, the end of the Revolutionary War in France, in Paris. It was called the Treaty of Paris. He then was a New York delegate to the Continental Congress and served as president of that group, and was then appointed to be the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And as David pointed out to me, as Chief Justice, he also was appointed to lead the negotiations for the Jay Treaty, which prevented a further war, delayed a further war with Great Britain. So John Roberts, eat your heart out. They didn't adhere to separation of powers as much back then as they do now. But David has written a fabulous book that was described by the Wall Street Journal as superb. And the title of the book, as you can see, is Liberty's Chain, Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York. And it's one of a number of books that David has written about slavery in New York. One is Emancipating New York, and another one is a document collection with another professor of important documents related to slavery and its abolition in New York State. And I think if you look real hard to David's left, you'll see those books in his bookshelf, which is massive and has a number of volumes, and I'm sure David has read them all. He is currently a history professor at DePauw University. He did his undergraduate work at Amherst and did his master's and doctoral work at Northwestern. And he is a very much a specialist in this area, which I think is going to be a very, very hot topic, for lack of a better word, in the next decades as we explore further the American story as it relates to slavery and its abolition. So it's a fitting discussion for today, which is Juneteenth. And again, as Joan said, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. We'll get to them. So without further ado, David Gelman.
Thank you, and good evening. And Joan and John, thank you for arranging this event and for the warm introduction. And most of all, thank you to the audience for being here and for incorporating this evening into your Juneteenth reflections. I will open with a few brief remarks to orient you to my subject and to place some provocative evidence before you, and then we'll turn this into more of a conversation, which can go wherever John and you, the audience, want to take it. So, who was John Jay? John Jay was, without a doubt, one of the 7 most influential of the revered founding fathers. And of those 7, the least studied and most underappreciated, though perhaps not to people in Westchester County. Now, you're looking at this slide and I said 7 and you're counting up and you see 5. So of the 7, only John Adams is the only one who never owned slaves. All the other of the top 7 founders were slave owners, as we'll discuss both in my remarks and in the conversation afterwards. So as a diplomat, Continental Congress officer, state constitution writer, federal constitution advocate, and New York governor, John Jay's influence was deep and broad. But the hat of fame tends to hang on the hook of first. So as John mentioned, John Jay was the first Chief Justice of the United States appointed to the Supreme Court by George Washington. And here he's pictured in his famous judicial robes. His years as Chief Justice, 1789 to 1795, offer a microcosm of the ways in which questions of Black slavery and Black freedom remain an unresolved but unavoidable subject for Jay, the founding fathers, and the nation as the U.S. began to chart its course in the wake of the U.S. Constitution's ratification. Embarking on his new post as Chief Justice, John Jay resigned another post that had made him another remarkable first. Since 1785, he had served as the inaugural president of the New York Manumission Society, one of the world's first anti-slavery organizations. He apparently thought being a member of such a group conflicted with his role as a judge. He, however, did not see his status as the owner of enslaved people as in conflict with his role as a judge. In fact, the first federal census in 1790, and if you see the little arrow here, you can see John Jay's name. In the first federal census of 1790, it records John Jay as the owner of 5 people. Indeed, becoming Chief Justice enhanced Jay's perceived need to enslave. He acquired a man named Pete to attend to his personal needs as he rode circuit while a federal trial judge, an onerous duty that Supreme Court justices no longer perform. So he actually acquired this man named Pete precisely because of his duties as a circuit court riding judge back when Supreme Court judges had other responsibilities and there was no temple of justice in Washington, D.C. from which to preside. So right there, a stark contradiction emerges. John Jay, the recently resigned lead officer in an anti-slavery organization, was still in the business of owning and acquiring enslaved people. He was aware of slavery's philosophically problematic status, as well as the personal hardships imposed on enslaved people, imposed, I might add, by people like John Jay. In a letter to his son, Peter Augustus Jay, in 1791, John remarked, quote, "Providence has placed these persons in stations below us. They are servants, but they are men." Before he condescendingly added, "Kindness to inferiors more strongly indicates magnanimity than meanness." In other words, he was talking about himself and seeing himself as a kind person. While a slavery case never came before him as Chief Justice, he referred to slavery in the consequential 1793 case Chisholm versus Georgia. Jay wished to make a distinction between, quote, feudal ideas about the power of governments over subjects and the principles of equal liberty and equal justice that applied to sovereign citizens in the United States. As an aside, he acknowledged, quote, "African slaves among us," end quote, might occupy a position akin to subjects. In other words, slavery was, in Jay's terms, was a feudal outcropping, an acknowledged anomaly in a system of justice predicated on equality. Jay articulated his thinking about this anomaly and what could be done about it when the Chief Justice ran for governor of New York in 1792. In that campaign, Jay's status as a slaveholder did not protect him from the suspicion that if elected, he would attempt to deprive his fellow New Yorkers of their enslaved property. This concern was based on the fact that he had indeed previously headed an anti-slavery organization, as I mentioned. In a letter to one of his supporters who raised this concern that people out there were talking about how he was untrustworthy in protecting slave property, the Chief Justice declined to disavow his anti-slavery principles. Jay praised the Manumission Society's commitment to protect New York's Black population from, quote, men stealers, who sought to spirit them out of the state, and to educate Black children, quote, who will now become useful members of society. Wrote Jay, in my opinion, every man of every color and description has a natural right to freedom. Jay viewed a gradual emancipation process as the right and realistic path forward. Like virtually all his white anti-slavery contemporaries, he did not favor a government-mandated immediate emancipation. Jay's anti-slavery reputation may well have cost him the election, given the razor-thin margin of his defeat. Several of the counties with the largest concentration of enslaved people went to his opponent, incumbent Governor George Clinton. Jay performed better in counties with smaller proportions of enslaved people, and in New York City, where the Manumission Society's actual work was presumably better understood. So here lies a revealing and perhaps surprising irony. We in 2022 may rightly view Chief Justice Jay's position on slavery as self-serving hypocrisy at worst and timidity at best. But Jay paid a political price for a reputation as an opponent of slavery, which in a very real sense, he was. The contradictions of Chief Justice John Jay's stance on slavery during these years became most apparent, not on the bench, but in diplomatic chambers. In a move that is unfathomable now, and controversial even then, President Washington tapped the sitting Chief Justice to travel to Britain to negotiate a treaty that would stave off a potentially devastating war with the former mother country. In May 1794, the Chief Justice boarded a ship with a small party that included his son, Peter Augustus, and the enslaved man, Pete, who he had acquired several years before. One very interesting thing about Pete's presence with the Jays in England is that as a result of a very famous 1772 ruling by Lord Mansfield, England's Chief Justice, slavery had no legal standing on English soil. Someone bringing an enslaved person there could not compel that person to remain a slave. Jay surely knew about Mansfield's famous Somerset decision. I can thus only presume that Jay calculated that Pete, who left a wife back in America, would not contest his bondage while overseas, because presumably he wanted to return home. Indeed, as we have evidence that Pete longed for home, a feeling exacerbated by the scorn and torments of the English servants the Jays hired heaped upon Pete during his English sojourn. He was not well treated there by his peers. At the level of policy and principle, however, Jay's English mission fortified Jay's anti-slavery principles in interesting ways. One of the issues agitating relations with the British was the fact that as the War for Independence wound to its formal conclusion in 1783, thousands of formerly enslaved African Americans departed as free people with the British. This, many Americans claim, was a violation of the terms of the peace treaty with Britain that Jay himself had helped to negotiate in Paris. Jay, however, in his 1794 negotiations in England, failed to deliver any sort of financial compensation for these departed former enslaved people. What's more, Jay informed Secretary of State, the Virginian Edmund Randolph, that the British position against compensation was right and the American demand wrong. Jay conceded that at the end of the war, the British had rightly protected the natural rights of the enslaved people who accepted the offer of freedom and protection behind British lines during the war. Randolph detailed his intense displeasure with Jay's concession, but it was too late to make a difference. The treaty, which has gone down in history as the Jay Treaty, made no mention of compensation for the Black people who had long ago evacuated to freedom with the British. Meanwhile, during his extended stay in England, Jay befriended the great parliamentary lion of abolitionism, William Wilberforce. When he and his entourage returned to the US in the spring of 1795, Jay's service as Chief Justice essentially ended. While overseas, his New York friends ran him for governor of New York again, and this time, no longer running against the popular incumbent George Clinton, Jay won. His time as governor would, it turned out, be incredibly consequential for the history of slavery in New York and the United States. In 1799, during Governor Jay's second term, the state finally passed a gradual abolition law, a law we can get into during the discussion if you'd like. But I would like to conclude by peering even farther into the future. During the 19th century, John Jay's son, Peter Augustus Jay, became a very consequential opponent of slavery and defender of Black rights. His younger son, William Jay, and his grandson and namesake, John Jay II, would become major forces in the more radical campaigns to end slavery throughout the United States that began in earnest in the 1830s and lasted into the Civil War. In the wake of William Jay's death in 1858, none other than the great African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass delivered a public eulogy in which he proclaimed of John Jay's second son, "In the great cause of universal freedom, his name was a tower of strength and his pen a two-edged sword." As radical abolitionists, the next generations, especially William, had to answer pointed questions about how they could call for the immediate and total abolition of slavery in the South when the founding father, John Jay, had taken an ostensibly moderate, tolerant, and tempered approach to slavery. And indeed, looked at one way, it was strange that the latter Jays would embrace the cause most likely to tear apart the nation, whose founding was the source of their family's name and grand historical reputation. Therein hangs a tale, and it is the tale I share in the last 2/3 or so of my book. It is the story about the transmission and transformation of values. It is the story of slavery and emancipation that shapes our nation down to the present day. It is a story that helps us think more clearly about the legacy of racism and of anti-racism, and that gives us new ways to think about what we mean when we use such charged words as conservative, radical, and patriot. I look forward to exploring this terrain with you in the rest of our conversation tonight. And with that, I turn myself over to John and to the audience.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Gelman. Again, if anyone has questions, put them into the chat box. I will read them. Right now, we don't have any questions, so I'll start off with one unrelated to the issue of slavery, and that is Professor Gelman, why do you think John Jay is a forgotten founding father? He accomplished many things, and although he was a slave owner, he didn't have the military background that George Washington did. He didn't invent anything like Ben Franklin, and he didn't die in a duel like Alexander Hamilton. But those are probably not the reasons that he's a forgotten founding father. What do you think is working there? Why is he forgotten?
It's a great question, and the picture I have up now, by the way, is of the John Jay Homestead, which is a state historic site, which I highly encourage everyone to go visit if you haven't visited. And this is where he retired. So in essence, it was his equivalent to Monticello or Mount Vernon. But even in looking at this this picture, you very much know when you visit the Jay Homestead that you're not on a Southern plantation and you're not in the world of the grand colonial and imperial pretenses of some of his more famous founding fathers. I mean, it's a wealthy man's house, but it presents very differently. So as I said, I mean, without a doubt, you know, if you were to make a list of 7 and after 7, the drop off is precipitous. I mean, he was extremely well regarded by most of those men, although his dealings with Jefferson could be chilly, and the Jays really disliked Jefferson for reasons that we may get into. But I think the reasons are very accidental. Part of it is because the Jay family papers stayed in Jay family hands well into the 20th century in a way that other papers did not. The Adamses very carefully curated their papers and made sure that the Mass Historical Society had them and made sure everyone would have access to this story. As a result, when, you know, in the 20th century, when a lot of the sort of modern professional history gets written, right, you have these marvelous NEH funded programs to create volumes of every last scrap of paper and letter and ledger book that Hamilton, Franklin, I mean, the Franklin papers there's so many of them, they're still being put together, but you have these massive archival projects that the other, I don't want to say rivals because they're not necessarily his rivals, some of them were, the sort of access to the papers was much better for the others. I think that has a lot to do with it. The fact that really you don't start to get J papers going into archives in any significant portions until, well into the 20th century. And a lot of those papers are at Columbia. But a lot of the papers are still here at the Jay Homestead, where they're, the funds have just never been there to fully catalog them. And though there have been some excellent editorial projects, there's a 7-volume selected papers of John Jay project that just wound up, but that's selected. Whereas if you go to any university library, or maybe even the Chappaqua Library, and you see the papers of Thomas Jefferson, they're as wider than, than I can hold out my arms. And so I think that has a lot to do with it. I think also, there is a way in which Americans are very presidentially obsessed, which explains, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington and Adams, of course. And then, as you say, look, Ben Franklin, there's aspects of Ben Franklin's story, and thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda and Ron Chernow, there's aspects to Hamilton's story that just sort of lend themselves to, if not, no one, I don't think anyone foresaw a rap musical, but lend themselves to dramatic rendering and sort of capturing the public imagination. But if you want to talk about a person who was there, every there that mattered, you could argue that John Jay was almost more of that person than many of the others. And also it's worth noting how much he was admired by Washington and Hamilton. That as strange as it is that they sent a sitting Chief Justice to negotiate this treaty, it's a mark of how much faith Washington had in John Jay. There's a reason why Washington appointed him to be the first Chief Justice, but John Jay also had certainly once Franklin passes away in 1790, no one had the foreign policy chops really better than John Jay. He spent a ton of time in Spain before he went on to Paris to negotiate the Peace of Paris. He spoke because of his Huguenot background. He had a facility in French, and he was in the post-war period. He was the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, which was a very frustrating task, and that's one of the reasons he was one of the people that Joe Ellis identified as part of the quartet that really pushed the idea that we needed a constitution. And in some ways, John Jay's substantive contribution to that was the incredibly frustrating experience of being a Secretary of Foreign Affairs in a government that's a national government that simply could not function as a national government and therefore could not deliver on the nation's treaty obligations or represent itself powerfully in an Atlantic world full of ambitious empires, Britain, Spain, and France, not to mention the Dutch. And so John Jay really was one of those people who said, like, we really need to have this constitution. And then, of course, is one of the 3 authors of the Federalist Papers. He was denied, he was not sent to Philadelphia because Governor Clinton was very anti-constitution and did not want to beef up and give any more prestige to the New York delegation than he had to. And so that's why John Jay was not in Philadelphia. But so I think, it's not the only reason why I undertook this project, but certainly it's one of the reasons that if you want to understand early America, the early period of the Republic, and the importance of the issue of slavery within that Republic and defining it in all kinds of ways, then John Jay gives us a whole set of tools and opens a whole set of windows that when we leave him out of it, we simply don't have access to. And so I hope that at least somewhat answers the question.
For sure. Thank you for that. There is a question that actually there's a couple questions. How many other slaves did John Jay have, and how did he treat them? And I guess I'll add to that, when the family became more inclined to be abolitionists, did relinquish their slaves, or did they have them also? They owned slaves at that time as well.
All great questions. So the household generally had about 5 or 6 enslaved people at any one time. So I mean, and because we only get that sort of decennial censuses, you can't simply add those numbers up. And before the war, there were Peter Jay, and half the family's name is Peter, but Peter Jay, John Jay's father, he was one of the most, he owned a significant number of slaves. He was one of the biggest slaveholders in his part of Westchester County. So a number of people passed through as enslaved people. He acquired a slave in Martinique on his way over to Paris, or on his way over to Spain on his negotiating tour for during the American Revolution. He also brought a slave from his wife's father's household, Abigail, or Abby, whose story is incredibly tragic. So in terms of numbers, right, we're not talking Southern plantation numbers, but the households that John Jay maintained, like all wealthy families in New York, all wealthy white families in New York, contain slaves, and the Jays are married into and do business with all those slavery. So their Jay family slaveholding goes all the way back to his grandfather, Auguste, who was the first Jay to immigrate from France, and Auguste and Peter Jay traded for slaves in the Caribbean. So it wasn't their primary business, but as part of their business as merchants trading with the Caribbean, they brought slaves into New York for sale. So Jay is very much part of the New York elite and the New York elite and colonial New York in general. People don't realize, that significant proportion of the colonial population of New York was enslaved. I think in New York City, that mid 18th century, 20% of people in Manhattan were enslaved, and slavery was very common on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley. So that's the milieu he comes from. The more qualitative question being asked is what kind of slave owner was he? And what I would say is it depends. His treatment of enslaved people ran the gamut from sort of kindness to cruelty, with a lot of, and mostly in between, a sort of vague indifference. He certainly instilled in his sons and nephews the notion that for elderly, loyal, by their definition, enslaved people were to be taken care of and looked after and provided for economically, not in any sort of grant, but that he would instruct his son and his nephew, you got to make sure that old Mary is treated in her old age, that she's treated well, that she gets proper care. And so that's sort of on one side of it. But callous and uncomprehending also describe his ownership of slaves. I mean, the most famous story that the historian Martha Jones wrote a piece about in the New York Times travel section about 6 months ago, and that I wrote about in this book, and I've written about in other articles. She was brought over to Europe with the family, and Sally Jay, Sarah Livingston Jay, gives birth, and Abby's there to take care of them and deal with, hold the household together. But Abby gets fed up with a French servant who's being very cruel to her. Kind of, it's the same sort of story as the one that I told about Pete. So this is in 1783. John has just negotiated the peace treaty and is off in England taking some R&R, and Abby decides, I'm going to leave the family and take up wage work with a local laundress. And Ben Franklin, so John's out of town, and Sally and her nephew, Peter J. Monroe, are trying to figure out what to do. And they ask Ben Franklin, and Ben Franklin says, I've got connections. We'll teach her a lesson. We'll throw her in a French jail, where she gets probably pneumonia and gets very sick, and they bring her back to the household, but she dies. It's an incredibly tragic story. And John, who's still out of the country in England, in the correspondences, he's sort of dumbfounded as to what Abby was thinking. He can't travel the distance. Like, it's easier. Enslaved people have to think about what their owners, their masters think, because their well-being and even their survival depend on it. But if you're John Jay, in some ways, right, the enslaved people are a bit of a mystery to him. And he says, I don't understand why she did that. I would have freed her when we got back. I told her I was going to free her when we got back to the United States. Now, whether he made that promise or not, we'll never know. But what he couldn't comprehend is that, A, why should she trust him? And B, she was having a very human reaction to a very difficult situation. She's in France. She's separated from her husband for years and years. She's now being treated poorly by a French servant, and she miscalculates, but it comes from a very human place that John Jay can't fully comprehend. Just as he wants to be nice to this guy, Pete, that I mentioned, but he's also subjecting him to a separation from a spouse and to the teasing and vulnerability that a Black man in England has, even to his fellow servants who are from that place. He's never happy to have small children in the house, and on more than one occasion, when an enslaved woman has a child, he tries to figure out either how to make the child or the whole situation disappear. I think his concern was, if a mother is attending to a young child, then she's not attending to the needs of the household, right? So very kind of self-serving in that way. And the most infamous case, and this will get to your last part, which is when do they become free? So a long time, a woman who's born into the Jay family and who spends most of her entire life in the Jay family is a woman named Clorinda. So she was enslaved in Peter Jay household and winds up in the John Jay household. And she has a daughter named Zilpah. And this is when this takes place here in the John Jay Homestead after John Jay is retired and his wife has passed away. Zilpah gets pregnant, and John Jay basically says, all right, we can't have her in the household. And he basically ships her off to a Livingston in-law, says, well, you're going to have to leave this household and go serve in this other household. And when that infant dies, Clorinda, in an incredibly gutsy and heartrending move, begs the Jays to bring Zilpah back, her only child, her only person that she's, has a family in the world. And because the child died, John Jay says, all right, well, we'll bring her back into the household, but only because her toddler had died. And the reason this gets us to the last part is, so Zilpah and Clorinda are the last two people who are enslaved in the John Jay household here in Katona. And in 1817, John Jay probably inaccurately calculates that Zilpah's about to turn 25 and decides, well, even though I'm not legally obligated to free her at age 25 because she was born before 1799, which is the date after which anybody born of a slave mother by New York law is born free and then has to serve their mother's master until the age of 25, female. So he applies that formula to Zilpah and frees her at what he thinks is approximately age 25. And then Clorinda, all I can tell you is that by the 1820 census, she's no longer listed as a slave. She's listed as a free servant. So those are the last two people in the Jay household. So the children well, that's not right. Peter Augustus, when younger, has responsibility for an enslaved person, but they don't really maintain they have households with former slaves, but not slaves. But by 1820, they are no longer enslaved people in John Jay's household. But Clorinda and Zilpah lives the rest of her life in the household. She's mentioned in John Jay's will, like, I hope my children will see to her comfort. She dies in 1837. And Zilpah, the last census that she appears in the household is 1850, but she clearly stays in the Jay family orbit and is by William Jay's last will and testament has a place in the Jay family burial plot where she resides to this day and her headstone remains. So slavery ends, but the story of enslaved people and the afterlife of slavery never leaves the Jay family because of the stories that I just shared briefly with you.
Mm-hmm. Professor, one of your slides was of the 1790 census, which I think was the first census ever, and I see that it goes into detail as to the number of enslaved people in Westchester County, Bedford. Can you talk about the extent of slavery in the Hudson Valley?
It was very common. Very common in Westchester. Ulster, I would say, probably had maintained the highest percentage for the longest time. You tend to have smaller, so Ulster is right here, you can see on the map. You tend to have smaller, oftentimes just one or two enslaved people per household, but in the Dutch counties along the Hudson River, it's very common. Sojourner Truth, right, is born in a Dutch-speaking household. Her first language is Dutch. She's born in Ulster County, one of the most famous, abolitionists of her day or any day. In wealthy families, that is, enslaved people are the servant class, and that's also very much true for Manhattan. Now, there are some families like the Livingstons and the Morrises and the Phillipses who own, larger numbers of enslaved people, and enslaved people are doing every kind of work imaginable in the city. I mean, anything that can be, we sort of forget in the 21st century that like everything that in your household, right, that comes to you, power, water, right, was carried and it was hauled, in the colonial period. And in places like Manhattan, more often than not, right, the haulers, the carriers, in addition to being stevedores and teamsters of the waterfront, are enslaved people. In the more rural areas, it's a mix of agricultural work and household work and skilled work. There's an endless amount of work to be done in rural settings, and enslaved people are sort of part of the labor calculus. So they're not, they're not anywhere near a majority. Enslaved people are nowhere near a majority, but I mean, it's personal service and the hard work of hauling, carrying, harvesting, taking care of the horses. And it's, New York is the largest slaveholding area in America north of Maryland. And, the percentages remain high into the, Revolutionary era. I mean, and there are, 20,000 enslaved people in Manhattan around the time of independence, give or take, right? And similarly in the Hudson Valley and out on Long Island. And it's endemic. And part of the story where I, got the idea for this book is my first book was on the abolition of slavery in New York, and trying to figure out, like, how does a place that, if not a slave society, is certainly a society where slaves are present and a fully developed slave law exists, how does that society decide that it no longer wants to be so enmeshed in the institution of slavery, at least at the sort of the local level. And then the Jays then become part of that story, but then that story extends well beyond the time when slavery ends in New York, because New York becomes one of the centers of abolitionist activity, and the Jays, John Jay's son and grandson, are at the center of that activity in a way that really makes a national impact. So tracing that arc was kind of the goal and purpose of this multi-generational biography.
Thank you for that. We've got a bunch of questions, and one of them is related to what you just mentioned about how a society or a state or a city like New York City could, evolve into a free state when it was so dependent upon slavery. But the question is, realistically, how could any state force pro-slavery states to gradually emancipate slaves? And there's a could we have fought the British if not a united 13, if the 13 colonies were not united?
Well, I'll take that. I want to take that in parts. The reason I've thrown this picture up here, this is William Lloyd Garrison, who is sort of the figure most identified with the movement for immediate abolition. So this radical moment that emerges in the late 1820s and really takes off in the 1830s is often associated with this guy, Garrison. And the premise, as crazy as it sounds, that that William Jay supported was that moral persuasion, that slavery is a sin, and if it's a sin, then it's not something you stop 10 years down the road. You know, say I'm gonna sin for another 10 years and then I'm gonna stop. Like in this evangelical era, people like John Jay II and here pictured here, and John Jay and William Jay, produced a torrent of writings that, believe it or not, made the argument that that the South will end slavery because we're going to convince them that it's morally wrong, and that they believe that the Constitution does not give Congress the authority to end slavery, and they're not interested in violating the Constitution. I mean, William Jay was a judge in Westchester County. I mean, he's a sworn officer of the Constitution. He's trained in the law. So is his son, John Jay II. So they're what seems incredible and naive to us, but their notion was we're going to just deluge the South with literature explaining the evils of this institution. And we're going to make impassioned arguments. But you have to remember, this was a evangelical age where, things like alcohol consumption and the spread of the Bible and the torrent of new Protestant sects were remaking America at the same time that steam printing presses and more efficient ways of producing literature in New York was sort of the capital of literature production, are capable of creating a mass communications revolution in the United States that really does happen. That's not made up, right? That you can church the unchurched, you can sober up the drunk, and you can persuade the sinner, the slaveholder, to abandon this immoral institution. So their idea is that we're going to, and their idea is that ultimately, as William Jay argues, it's safer if you renounce slavery entirely. The South is sitting on top of a volcano, because the South, unlike New York, which had a lot of slaves but wasn't really a slave society, and there are southern states that are majority slave or 40% enslaved. They said, you guys are sitting on top of a volcano that's going to erupt, and it's going to bring the whole society down, or you can start doing the right thing, right? And you don't have to fear this institution, they argued, because we in the North abolished slavery and the sky didn't fall. And then they start pointing to the West Indies, where the British do abolish a mass, incredibly profitable institution in the 1830s. And they say, this did not lead, the world didn't come to an end. Britain didn't fall into disrepair and economic disarray. So they have this, what seems naive, but this powerful notion that you can constitutionally abolish slavery by using the press and the mail to make your case. That is, of course, as everyone in the audience knows, not how it happens. But you can make the argument that in some ways, like, look how slavery did in fact end in the South, through massive violence. 750,000 people died in the Civil War. Right? So
the moralistic argument did not work. Obviously, it didn't take into account, I guess, economics for one thing, and other things, and it was a war that had to be waged to stop it.
Yes, and the sort of, again, not to play the sort of not to over exaggerate what moral suasion can do, but in some ways you can argue, I mean, I'm going to kind of go out on a limb here, right? That in some ways the Civil War actually proves that that William J. and John J. II and the Garrisonians were right. Like, it's either going to end in cataclysmic violence, or it's going to end because people do the right thing. And so in a way that they did, I'm not going to say they predicted, the Civil War and how events played out, but you can make a sort of argument that they were actually right? That the more dangerous path is the path the South took: massive resistance, interdicting the mail so that information could not, penetrate too broadly into the South. I mean, they literally, Andrew Jackson and his Postmaster General decided, well, if Southerners don't want us to receive this mail, then we're going to we're going to allow Southerners to prevent the mail from being delivered. It's kind of like, I'll make a controversy analogy. It's like Putin shutting down, or the Chinese government shutting down Google. Like, the way to hold power is to silence the alternative perspective.
You spoke briefly about the Jay Treaty and how there was a brief discussion between Jay and Randolph about compensation, not to enslaved people, but to slave owners for the loss of their property. And that never, obviously that was not a provision in the Jay Treaty. Was that not contained in the Jay Treaty because Jay didn't press for it? Or was it not in the Jay Treaty because he really wasn't up for a tough negotiation with the Brits, because and many people say he gave up a lot. Was it not in the cards because Jay would have agreed to almost anything to stop a war at that time with Great Britain?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's a great question. So the way John Jay tells the story when he's explaining himself to Secretary of State Randolph is, look, I made my case, and my negotiating partner, Lord Granville, made a better case. Not only was he not going to budge, but then he goes on to describe, and this is where my argument comes from. He goes on to describe in detail to Randolph Grenville's argument for why the British don't owe the Americans anything. And it hinges on a sort of the philosophy of the Somerset decision, which is the notion that slavery is morally odious, and that's the word Somerset uses and the word that Jay reports that Lord Grenville uses. Slavery is odious, right? It's immoral. So absent a positive written law saying that you're allowed to practice it, that's why there's no slavery in England, because there's no written law. And they apply the same, Grenville applies the same logic. It would be odious of us to return the actual people, right? We promised them their freedom. They came to our lines, and then we evacuated them. We kept our promise to give formerly enslaved people their freedom. And the kind of argument is, so if it's odious, if it would have been odious for them to return the people, then are we really going to make the claim that we are going to demand money as a sort of substitute, a functional equivalent of returning the bodies, which obviously can't be returned, right? Because they're in Nova Scotia, and eventually many of them go to Sierra Leone. That the British, Jay concedes, have the high moral ground, and that maybe we don't even have a right. And then to bring in Hamilton, so when the Jay Treaty at first is incredibly unpopular for all kinds of reasons, but Jay is definitely directly criticized for not getting compensation for slaves, and none other than Alexander Hamilton takes up his pen, as he was wont to do, and he makes that very argument. He makes the Jay/Grenville argument that there's no morality in our claim, and so we should drop it. And of course, they're also making a practical argument. Are we really going to risk peace because of the howls of slave owners who want their money back? They both were both practical, but it's worth noting, Hamilton, not always known for making moral arguments, he makes the moral argument in public, writing under his pseudonym of Camillus, that this whole thing is odious, that it's not right And so why should we be demanding money if, in fact, all the Black people who ran to British lines were doing was following a promise of freedom? So, and, you know, it's a pretty good argument. And the fact that Jay is willing to kind of poke his finger in Randolph's eye by presenting it, like he could have just stopped and said, hey, I tried my best, I couldn't get it. But the fact that he goes on to sort of lay out the case for like, and in some ways, I'm glad I didn't get it, you know, tells you something about the sort of two-faced or dual, that's the wrong word, the dual way in which Jay can simultaneously think slavery is wrong while at the same time practicing the institution. I mean, he's got an enslaved person essentially illegally in Britain with him. And, you know, you see this with John Jay, that he kind of is on both tracks at the same time in ways that historians, you know, like me and the audience is frustrating. But it's, he is most definitely, I mean, again and again, he says, you know, no one is naturally a slave and no one should be naturally a slave. And so the solution is to wind this institution down in a way that is both realistic and looks after the interest of those who have a financial interest in slavery. And so he's a gradualist. And as I mentioned, so when his son, William Jay, becomes a fervent, I mean, this is just one of many books that pour out of his, you know, office. Fervent radical abolitionists. People say, how can you're breaking with the memory of your temperate, moderate father? And it drives William Jay nuts because he loves his father and he wrote a biography of his father and he lives in his father's house and he's working in his father's office and he's got servants who were his father's slaves. But he says, you know, John Jay, don't focus on the how, focus on the what. So William Jay is very much about, my father wanted slavery to end. He recognized that after slavery, enslaved people would become citizens, and focus on the end, not the means. The means have shifted. It's the 1830s, it's not the 1790s, but the ends, William Jay kept insisting, were, he said, I imbibed, that's literally a quote, I imbibed my anti-slavery from my father. And at some level, who's to argue with him? He was, you know, that's what he believes. He believes that he's inheriting the values of his father, whereas his critics, his conservative critics, of which there are many, are like, you've gone off the deep end. You're following the fanatics and radicals down this road that's going to rip the nation apart.
Right. You mentioned
they're not wrong either. Yeah.
You mentioned the Somerset decision, and that's if I might be misstating it, but I think that's a decision from the highest British court that slaves, that there was the institution of slavery was illegal, for lack of a better word, in Great Britain, and that any enslaved person that was in Great Britain was therefore free. So I take it when John Jay was in Great Britain with this enslaved person, there was a risk that if that person escaped, he would have been free. But I would ask you if that's true, but my question actually is related to that. Did the Somerset decision said that slavery was illegal in Great Britain, but since the colonies were a colony of Great Britain, if they had continued to exist as a colony, presumably that law would have existed then and be applied to the colonies, which would have been a shot across the bow to the South. Have you ever come across any writings or discussions by Southern leaders as to whether the application of the Somerset rule in the colonies was a reason or served as I don't think I'm saying anything too controversial, as a basis for their participation in the revolution as opposed to the North?
This gets very complicated. So the thing about the Somerset decision is what Lord Mansfield is ruling is in England, because it actually doesn't apply to Scotland. In England has no written law, what they call positive law. Positive law is written law, as you know. So what Mansfield was saying is, absent positive law, written law, the assumption is freedom. But the colonies, not just the mainland colonies, but I mean the West Indies, where Britain's real wealth interest lies, they have, quote unquote, the positive law of slavery. And so technically the Somerset decision makes a distinction between England, and it doesn't apply to the rest of the empire, you know, through the in the strictest sense of the law. Now, the other shoe can always drop. It does make a distinction. Like, it does, I think, suggest to at least some people, like, well, then can we count on England? But I don't think a lot of other shoes would have had to drop for that to apply. But where the Somerset principle starts to matter is, once you get widespread abolition north of the Mason-Dixon line, you get a version, or at least the debate, or at least the idea that the Somerset principle might apply to free territory. And so the Fugitive Slave Law and the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution is designed to prevent the Somerset principle from going into operation in the United States. Because what does the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution say? It says that these other fugitives from justice and these other persons, confined to labor, never uses the word slavery, right? They have to be returned. That it's not crossing into a free state doesn't guarantee you freedom. So we actually designed the Constitution to prevent the Somerset principle from operating in this new constitutional republic. So that's one of the reverberations of the Somerset law. Now, philosophically, other area which William Jay very much gets into the law of this, and there's a very famous Steven Spielberg movie, Amistad, that some of you may have seen in the, I'm going to say the 80s, maybe the 90s. The sea is another place where what law applies. So when enslaved people rebel outside of the boundaries of the United States, William Jay, who's a very savvy jurist, is feeding arguments and making arguments about, well, that's at sea, natural law prevails, and there is no, slavery is not a natural institution. So where there is no law or legal jurisdiction of slavery, if slaves take up arms and claim their freedom, they're not pirates, they're revolutionaries, right? They're give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry disciples. And so Somerset creates not always necessarily a strict legal precedent, but a way of framing for both pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people, a way of framing the legal and philosophical debate about what happens in the inevitable gray areas when you have a nation that is half enslaved, half free. And that, is an engine of American history in the middle of the 19th century.
Thank you for that. We have time for one last question, and it's, and I'll read it from the chat board. Are the topics that we've discussed tonight taught in college courses at DePauw? The answer is probably yes, and but also in other institutions, other colleges and universities.
Well, you can be sure when I'm holding the chalk, this stuff comes up, and it has sort of shaped. In some ways, I try to lay off of the J's to my students because they sort of come up naturally in conversation. But yes, I think that my goal in writing a book like this is that that more people find more ways to introduce this material into the classroom. So I really did not, and I don't just say this as sort of self-promotion, although I am also saying this in self-promotion. I didn't write this book for my fellow academics. I wrote it for educated readers, old and young, right? College students and their parents, and people who loved history in school or only realized after they were out of school, as so often happens, history is actually, much more interesting and important and dynamic than I realized in school. That's who this book is for, because I feel like our conversation about the founders and slavery tend to get in an endless Jefferson loop. And it's not that I would ever say that Thomas Jefferson is not important. Obviously, it's very important for the history of slavery and all kinds of other issues. But to say that there are other reservoirs of history. There are other inspirations we can draw from history and the founding legacy than the one wrapped up in the sort of endless debates about Thomas Jefferson that, of course, often have centered around his relationship to Sally Hemings, but also how can the author of the Declaration of Independence have owned so many enslaved people and become, in essence, late in life. And this might be a good place where I can end and draw some distinctions. Late in life, Thomas Jefferson was functionally kind of an apologist for slavery. This is where I want to end, actually. So when the Missouri crisis broke out, whether Missouri could enter the Union as a slave state or not, which paralyzed the body politic in Congress for almost 3 years, Thomas Jefferson said the incendiary sons are trying to rip apart the republic that their fathers founded. Well, he was not necessarily thinking of the Jays, but he might as well have been, because Peter Augustus Jay was organizing anti-Missouri rallies in New York City. And this document here is John Jay lived till 1829, but his last significant political public statement was this letter released in 1819, right around the same time that his son was organizing an anti-Missouri rally in New York. And it's a letter that he wrote that he knew was going to get published. And it's a letter in which the first Chief Justice, the author of the Federalist Papers, one of the last of the founding fathers, quotes the Constitution and says, of course, the Constitution gives us a right to deny Missouri's slavery in Missouri. This passage here is him quoting the Constitution. And then John Jay says in this letter, again, one of his last important political statements, he quotes, what does he quote? He quotes Jefferson's Declaration of Independence as evidence that the founders were actually against slavery. This is the last, 10 years before he dies, the last major political act of his life is to write this letter where he quotes the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence against the idea that slavery should spread, while Thomas Jefferson down in Virginia is denouncing these northern incendiaries for threatening the future of the country by daring to raise the issue of preventing the spread of slavery. By daring to raise that, Jefferson calls it a fire bell in the night, but John Jay calls it a clarion call to our founding principles that, of course, Jefferson was the most famous expositor.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And I am very appreciative of being educated about this area of American history. And I have a feeling that there'll be a lot more writings about these topics in the future. And you're at the forefront, really. This is one of the first books that touches on this issue of slavery and abolition in New York, for sure. And it recognizes that the founders did great things. Obviously, they established the first representative democracy, but they also, many of them, except for one or two, owned enslaved people. So it's something we need to acknowledge and grapple with, and it's very appropriate on Juneteenth to do so. So thank you very much. I see Joan.
No, as I emailed you, I chatted with you, John. This was all, it was fascinating. First of all, your enthusiasm, David, is amazing for the subject, and it comes across in your presentation. And I'm sort of dumbfounded about how ignorant I was about this part of our history. And I so much appreciated everything you said. It was really wonderful. And I could see how your book is written for me because of the way you presented. It's for people who are not that well versed in American history. And this would be a fabulous program for all. And I encourage you to purchase the book and to get it at Scattered Books. And if you're in, call them up or go online, scatteredbooks.com, and they'll be able to get you personalized copies of the book. So it was amazing. It was an amazing talk. I had no idea. And of course, it only comes down to John Diaconus, who knows exactly how to get a speaker. You're unbelievable, John.
Well, if I do get a speaker, I know where to send them, because
you know exactly.
You and the Chappaqua Library are so user friendly, and the product you put out is really amazing. And
we're
a big library
what you
person.
do, let me tell you.
You guys are great.
You
David, I can't wait for my copy of the book to come in, and I'm going to look forward to your next book also, whatever it may be.
Look forward to it too. And by the way, how long did it take you? Did you say 9 years or something?
Oh my gosh. I mean, the original exploratory research was in, I think, the summer of 2000.
A long time, huh?
Yes, my children cannot remember, my adult children cannot remember a time when I was not working on this book. So it took them from birth to adulthood.
Okay, it works for me. So again, David, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Yes. We really appreciate it. And so does the Chappaqua community and the environs. And of course, John, my undying thanks to you for picking the best.
You're welcome, and thank you.
We hope to see you. Don't forget to purchase the book, and please don't forget to go to the Chappaqua Library. And if for any program you're interested in, go to chappaqua.library.org on your computer. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening. All right, bye everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.